Hey everyone, this is Miss Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us topic 1.2, which is all about terrestrial biomes. As you watch this video, please make sure that you are taking down notes using the follow along notes that were given to you in class. If you have any questions, please save those for when we return to class on Monday. So here we go. All right, so in the first bullet point here, right, we are defining, right, what is a biome. We know that it is a characteristic of communities of plants as well as animals that typically result from a specific climate. And it's those plants and animals that are specifically adapted to that climate. The worldwide distribution of biomes is dynamic. That distribution has changed in the past and it continues to shift as we see changes in climate now. We know terrestrial biomes refers to land biomes. The 9 land biomes we need to know for our course is the taiga or boreal forest, the temperate rainforest, the temperate seasonal forest or deciduous forest, tropical rainforests, shrubland, temperate grassland, savanna, desert, and the tundra. Here is the distribution of biomes that we find on Earth. Remember in class today, we mentioned that at the equator, right, we seem to get the most direct sunlight, which means we're going to see the most precipitation, which typically tells us that any type of tropical-like climate will be experienced in those areas. As we move farther and farther away from the equator, we have less direct sunlight, colder temperatures, most likely less evaporation, which leads to less rainfall. So let's specifically look at what we know as the tundra. If you take a look to the right, this is an example of a climatogram where we find the tundra. You'll notice that very little rainfall happens throughout the year in the tundra, and it has a tremendous amount of variety in terms of its average monthly temperatures. We can see that it can range between about 15, 16 or so degrees Celsius and drop all the way down to almost negative 30 degrees Celsius during the year. So that means in this very cold, treeless biome, we see lots of low growing vegetation. In the winter, the soil is typically completely frozen. The tundra's growing season is very short because of the climate they experience. The underlying subsoil, which is known as permafrost, is an impermeable, permanently frozen layer that prevents any water from draining and roots from penetrating. During the growing season, you may find maybe woody shrubs, mosses, and lichens, but chemical reactions in this climate tend to occur very slowly because of the low temperatures, so this usually leads to very slow decomposition, so we see very low levels of soil nutrients. So we don't necessarily get forest-like ecosystems in the tundra because of the lack of nutrients and lack of decomposition and cold. Now, moving closer to the equator now, getting to the taiga, right? We'll see a little bit more rainfall versus the tundra. We still see lots of variety in terms of average monthly temperature. Doesn't get as cold as the tundra, but obviously is still pretty chilly. So here, the taiga, or also known as the boreal forest, is made up of coniferous trees or cone-bearing evergreen trees. They are adapted to tolerate the cold winters and short growing seasons that they experience. The boreal forest is usually found between 50 and 60 degrees north latitude in Europe, Russia, and in North America. The subarctic biome has a very cold climate, and plant growth is constrained by those temperatures and precipitation. So, once again, the soil is nutrient poor due to low decomposition, and the needles in this biome are actually resistant to decomposition when they fall because they have a very waxy covering. And so, the taiga is actually a very poorly suited climate for agriculture purposes. But the taiga or boreal forests are incredibly important sources of trees for things like pulp, paper, and building materials. So oftentimes when we talk about deforestation, it's also the boreal forest or taiga that is impacted by that human activity. Moving on to the temperate rainforest. Here we can see a lot more rainfall in this biome with not as much variety in terms of their average monthly temperature. It does not vary as much as it does in the tundra and the taiga. So here in the temperate rainforests, it's actually ocean currents that are going to help to moderate the temperature fluctuations that we see. This biome has nearly a 12-month growing season where winters can be very rainy and summers are very foggy. They have a moderate temperature, very high precipitation. Those mild temperatures and high rainfall helps to support the growth of very large trees in this area, which is why we see things like firs, spruces, cedar, hemlock, or even the sequoia trees, which we know are found in the world's largest redwoods in California. Lots of logging also occurs in this biome. Once again, it has slow decomposition due to its cold temperatures and needles, and a little bit lower in nutrients for soil. Looking at the temperate seasonal forest, here we have a little more average in terms of rainfall throughout the year, as well as temperature. Here in the temperate seasonal forest, or also known as temperate deciduous forest, this is dominated by broadleaf trees like beech, maple, and oak. We experience warmer summer temperatures, which help to favor decomposition, so soils can contain more nutrients than maybe the boreal forests. Usually found away from coasts, summers are warmer and winters are colder. Soils are very productive, so much of it's been converted for agriculture. Moving then to the equator, we see the tropical rainforest. Here we see lots of rainfall and very little change in average monthly temperature here. So in the tropics, the average annual temperature can exceed 20 degrees Celsius, can become very hot. This biome is usually located between maybe 20 degrees north, south of the equator, or directly on the equator. Precipitation happens quite frequently. It's very warm, wet, very little temperature variation. So, because of that, the tropical rainforest probably has the most biodiversity per hectare than any other terrestrial biome we find on Earth. Its productivity is very high, decomposition is extremely rapid, but the vegetation takes up nutrients very quickly, which leaves very few nutrients in the soil. Here we see this is the shrubland or woodland, kind of similar to a chaparral here. We can see that there are wet seasons as well as dry seasons and very little variation amongst our temperature. In a shrubland or woodland, they have hot, very dry summers, mild, rainy winters. There's a 12-month growing season here, but the plant growth is constrained by that low precipitation they find in the summer. Because of that low precipitation, they are susceptible to wildfires. But the plants in this biome are adapted for that, meaning that many will resprout quickly after that fire, or some even depend upon it to produce their seeds. Plants also include very drought-resistant shrubs such as the yucca scrub, oak, and sage brush. Soil is low in nutrients because of the leaching by winter rains. And agriculture use for grazing animals or drought-tolerant deep-rooted crops such as grapes to make wine is used in these areas. Moving on to the temperate grassland. Here we see lots of rainfall here in like the summer months. We see a range in temperature as well. This biome usually has lowest average annual precipitation of any temperate biome. Remember that temperate refers to experiencing seasons. They have very cold, harsh winters, hot, dry summers, and the plant growth is constrained by insufficient precipitation that we find in the summertime and cold temperatures in winter. The plants include things like grasses or non-woody flowering plants. So you don't really find too many tree or forest type ecosystems in a temperate grassland here. The savanna or tropical seasonal forest, once again, you see wet and dry seasons. Here they have warm temperatures and distinct wet and dry seasons. The soil is fairly fertile and can be farmed due to high decomposition rates, but low amounts of precipitation will constrain plant species. We find grasses and maybe some scattered deciduous trees, and those trees will drop leaves during their dry season. In areas with very long dry seasons, um, tend to lead to the formation of savannas. Here we see the desert, right? Very little rainfall throughout the year, very hot temperatures that range. Usually, this biome is found between 30 degrees north and south latitude with high hot temperatures and extremely dry conditions. The plants that reside there, though, are well adapted. Typically, they have leaves that are very small, maybe even non existent, and usually a thick outer waxy layer or very few pores to prevent evaporation. We see slow growth of plants make them vulnerable to disturbance. And so, with all of that being said, we need to also take note at the resource distribution that each of these biomes may provide. And so, the global distribution of non mineral terrestrial resources like water and trees is going to vary between our climate, geography, the latitude, and even maybe altitude, nutrient availability, and soil. We can see that weather here, which is short-term conditions that it experience in our atmosphere in a local area. These things include temperature, humidity, clouds on a daily basis, versus climate, right? This is now our average weather over a given region over a given amount of time. So organisms possess distinct growth forms due to adaptations to local temperature and precipitation, and those regional differences help to determine which organisms can survive. It's important to note that at least 30% of Earth's land surface is covered by forest type ecosystems. And remember that biome distribution is dynamic, right? It has changed from the past and it continues to change now as a result of climate change. So we need to be aware of what biomes are most susceptible to that change and how they might change in the future. All right, everyone, that's the end of this video. You want to make sure that you simply just mark it as done.